Chapter 2 uses a Black Death to show how economic forces can drive major social change. The plague caused a massive decline in Europe's population, sharply reducing the supply of labor while land and needs remained largely unchanged. As labor became scarce, workers gained bargaining power, wages increased, and rigid feudal relationships weakened. These changes were driven by shifting incentives rather than moral progress or new ideas. The example illustrates how scarcity and incentives help explain why social and economic systems change over time.
In How Economics Explains the World, Andrew Lay argues that economics isn't just about markets, money, or equations. It's a way of understanding how humanity changes over time. By focusing on incentives, trade-offs, and scarcity, economics helps explain how societies develop the way they do. Rather than seeing history as driven only by kings, wars, or ideas, Lay shows that many major turning points can be understood through simple economic forces. When the cost and benefits people face change, their behavior changes, and over time, entire social systems adjust. One of the key examples Lay uses is the Black Death in medieval Europe. Instead of treating it only as a catastrophic event, he uses it to show how a sudden economic shock can reshape society. The plague dramatically reduced Europe's population, but land and production needs remained largely the same. This imbalance created new economic pressures and opportunities. Lay's approach encourages us to ask not just what happened, but why people responded the way they did. Instead of listing events, we're asking a more economic question. Why did wages, power, and social relationships change after the plague? Economists often look to history because it sometimes provides large, unexpected shocks that act like natural experiments. These events make it easier to see how economic systems respond when key variables change suddenly. Andrew Lay uses history because it provides clear, real-world examples of how economic incentives shape human behavior. Economists can't run experiments on entire societies, but history often gives us moments where conditions change suddenly. Events like the Black Death act as natural experiments. A large shock occurs that no one plans, allowing us to observe how people adapt when incentives shift. In this case, the most important change was the sudden loss of population. With fewer workers available, labor became scarce. Lay shows how this scarcity increased workers' bargaining power and altered long-standing social arrangements. What's important is that these changes weren't driven by new ideas about fairness or equality. Instead, people responded to new economic realities. Landowners needed workers, workers had more options, and the structure of society began to shift. By studying the history this way, Lay demonstrates how economics can explain not just markets, but the evolution of social and political systems.
To understand what happened after the plague, we need to explain one basic economic concept: labor supply. Labor supply refers to how many workers are available to do jobs in an economy. When labor is abundant, employers have many options. Workers are easier to replace, wages tend to be low, and workers have limited bargaining power. When labor becomes scarce, the situation changes. Workers become harder to replace, and employers must compete to attract and retain them. This usually leads to higher wages and better working conditions. After the Black Death, Europe lost a large portion of its population, while land and production needs stayed largely the same. The number of available workers dropped sharply. This created labor scarcity, which shifted incentives and bargaining power towards the workers. These changes were not driven by ideology or moral beliefs. They were the result of basic economic incentives responding to scarcity. Before the Black Death, much of Europe operated under feudal systems. Workers were tied to land, mobility was limited, wages were low, and landowners held most of the economic power. When the plague struck, the population declined dramatically. Afterward, landowners still owned the land, but they no longer had enough workers to farm it. Because workers were now scarce, landowners had to offer higher wages or better conditions to attract labor. From the workers' perspective, they had more options. If one landowner refused to pay more, another might be willing to do so. Over time, this shift weakened rigid feudal relationships and increased worker mobility. The key point is that these changes happened because labor became scarce, not because attitudes or laws changed overnight.
A common misconception is that feudalism declined primarily because people became more enlightened or socially progressive. While appealing, this explanation overlooks the economic forces at work. Chapter 2 shows that incentives changed first. Labor scarcity made it costly to maintain rigid systems that restricted wages and movement. Even when elites attempted to cap wages or limit worker mobility, those rules became difficult to enforce. Institutions changed because the old system no longer aligned with economic reality. Ideas and social norms followed changes in incentives rather than leading them.
There are several key takeaways from this example. First, scarcity can redistribute power. When something becomes scarce, its value increases, and those who control it gain leverage. Second, economic shock can weaken even deeply entrenched systems. Feudalism did not disappear immediately, but it became harder to sustain under new economic conditions. The Black Death was a devastating tragedy, but it was also an economic turning point. By reducing the labor supply, it changed incentives, shifted power, and reshaped social relationships. This example captures the central idea of Chapter 2. Economic forces play a major role in explaining why societies change over time.